The ocean had a way of making everything seem smaller. From the porch of our cottage, I could see the waves crashing against the rocks, hear the rhythmic roar of the tide. It was the kind of sound that should have been soothing, but lately, it only made the silence between me and Clara feel more profound. She'd moved in with me 6 months ago, trading the noise and grime of the city for this quiet, coastal town. I thought we were building something together, a fresh start, a life far from the career I'd torched with my own mistakes. But now, as she sat on the edge of the porch, her back to me, staring out at the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was already drifting away. She turned her head slightly, catching me watching her, and flashed me that smile of hers, the one that could light up a room. But tonight it seemed forced. "Hello, you okay?" she asked, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. I forced a smile in return. "Yeah, just thinking." She tilted her head, studying me with those eyes that always seemed to see right through me. "You think too much, David. Maybe it's time you let go of whatever's haunting you." I nodded, even though her words struck a nerve. Letting go had never been my strong suit, and she knew that better than anyone. Clara had been there when everything fell apart, when my last big story as an investigative journalist had blown up in my face, leaving me blacklisted and disgraced. She'd been the one who'd found me at my lowest, convinced me to start writing again, even if it was just local stories for a tiny newspaper that no one read. She'd been my salvation, or at least, that's what I'd wanted to believe. But lately, I'd started to wonder if there was more to Clara than the woman who'd helped me put the pieces back together. The first crack appeared one rainy night. I'd stayed late at the cottage, working on a freelance article while Clara was supposedly visiting a friend in town. She wasn't one to keep many secrets, or at least, I thought she wasn't. But when she returned that evening, soaked from the rain, she seemed different, distracted. She walked into the living room, water dripping from her hair, and gave me a quick peck on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late. Got caught up with Sophie." I looked up from my laptop, raising an eyebrow. Didn't know Sophie lived near the docks. Clara froze, just for a fraction of a second, before slipping off her coat and draping it over a chair. "Oh yeah, she's been staying with a friend down there. It's a whole thing. She needed someone to talk to." Her voice was smooth, casual. Too casual. I shrugged, pretending to accept the explanation, but a strange feeling settled in my chest, like the pressure building before a storm. I knew that stretch of the docks well enough. It wasn't a place for friendly visits. It was a place where shadows gathered, where deals were made in the dark. I told myself that I was overreacting, that I was just letting my old instincts get the better of me. But a few nights later, I woke up to find Clara sitting in the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a hushed tone. "I can't keep doing this. It's too risky." "No, he hasn't figured it out yet. Just make sure it's ready when I get there." She turned suddenly, catching sight of me standing in the doorway, and the look on her face was one I hadn't seen before, something close to fear. She hung up quickly, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Hey, you're up? Just checking in with Sophie again." "At 3 in the morning?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She forced a laugh, brushing past me toward the bedroom. "Yeah, she's having a hard time. I'll be right back to bed." I watched her walk away, the unease growing into a cold knot in my stomach. She never mentioned Sophie again after that, and I didn't press her. But the questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It wasn't until a week later that I found the first real clue. Clara had left her notebook on the kitchen counter, one of those cheap, spiral-bound ones she used for jotting down thoughts or sketches. I knew I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped through it, my eyes catching on a page near the back. In Clara's neat handwriting, a single line stood out. "Meet Victor. Midnight at the docks. Don't be late." I stared at the words, my mind reeling. Who was Victor? And why was she meeting him at the docks of all places? I tried to think of an explanation that made sense, but all I could picture was that night I'd overheard her on the phone, the tension in her voice, the way she'd looked at me, as if I might shatter the secret she was hiding. When she came home that evening, I confronted her with the notebook, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's this about, Clara? Who's Victor?" Her reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, and her eyes darted to the notebook in my hand. but she recovered quickly, letting out a breathless laugh. Victor's an old friend. He's in town for a little while, and he's helping me with some things. It's not a big deal. A friend you haven't mentioned in the year we've been together? I pressed, feeling the tension coil tighter. Why didn't you just tell me? She met my gaze, her expression softening, and for a moment, I almost believed her. I knew you'd get like this. You're always so suspicious, David. I didn't want you to think I was hiding something when I wasn't. Her words stung, and I felt a familiar sense of guilt creep in, mixing with my frustration. I'd spent so long digging into other people's secrets, into the dark corners of their lives, that I'd forgotten what it was like to trust someone without question. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was letting my own past cloud my judgment. Fine, I said, handing back the notebook. Just next time, tell me what's going on, okay? She smiled, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I promise. But as she tucked the notebook into her bag, I couldn't help but notice the tension in her movements, the way she avoided meeting my eyes. And I knew then that this was far from over. Over the next few days, Clara seemed to make an effort to close the distance between us. She cooked my favorite meals, left little notes in my office, and tried to distract me with talk of a weekend getaway. It should have put my mind at ease, but all I could think about was that name, Victor, and the look on her face when I'd brought it up. I started keeping track of her late-night outings, noting the time she left and when she came back. She never mentioned Victor again, but each time she slipped out of the house, I felt that knot in my chest tighten a little more. One evening, after she'd left for another quick visit with Sophie, I made a decision I knew I couldn't take back. I grabbed my coat, slipped outside, and followed her car as it wound through the dark, empty streets. She drove down to the docks, pulling into a deserted lot beside a row of warehouses. I parked a few blocks away, keeping to the shadows as I watched her step out of the car and disappear behind one of the buildings. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from the darkness. Victor, tall and lean, with a confident gait that set my nerves on edge. They spoke in low voices, too far away for me to hear. Victor handed Clara a small, dark case, and she glanced around nervously before tucking it under her arm. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking, feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line. When she came home that night, I didn't say anything. I just watched her, wondering how long it would take before the truth came out, wondering if I was prepared for what I might find. I kept waiting for Clara to slip up, to give me a reason to confront her again. But if she sensed my suspicions, she didn't let on. She continued with her life, smiling, joking, cooking breakfast like nothing had changed. But every time she looked at me with those dark, soulful eyes, I saw the distance between us growing, like a chasm she'd built to keep me from seeing what lay beneath. I knew I couldn't go on like this, trapped in a house with someone I no longer trusted. So I called Alex. It had been over a year since we'd spoken, but when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. Alex was always a sucker for intrigue, a digital mercenary who thrived on secrets and coded whispers. Back in my reporting days, he'd been my go-to for uncovering dirty truths that people thought they'd buried. And now, I needed him to dig up the dirt on the one person I thought I'd known best. We met in a rundown diner an hour outside of town, a place where the vinyl booths were cracked and the coffee tasted like ash. Alex slid into the booth across from me, his hoodie pulled up, his laptop already open. He had the same wiry frame and nervous energy I remembered, like a live wire ready to snap. "So, this is where you've been hiding out, huh?" he asked, glancing around the diner with a smirk. "Never pegged you as the small-town type." I shrugged, stirring the sludge that passed for coffee. "Things change. I needed to get away after everything went to hell." "Yeah, I heard about that," he said, his tone softening. "Look, David, I know this isn't easy for you, but if this woman's playing you, you need to know for sure. Are you sure you're ready to dig into this?" I nodded, my jaw tight. "I don't have a choice, Alex. I need to know what she's hiding." He nodded, flipping open his laptop. "All right, tell me everything you've got on her. I'll start with the basics: phone records, financials, social media. If she's up to something, we'll find it." A few days later, Alex sent me an encrypted email with the subject line, "Found something." I opened it with a sense of dread, my pulse quickening as I read through the report. Victor LaCroix, Mid-40s, a history of arrests for fraud, smuggling, and conspiracy. Most of the charges had been dropped, likely due to the influence of well-placed friends and bribes. He'd been linked to a series of black market deals along the coast, using the docks to move contraband, everything from art to narcotics. But the most disturbing detail was the timing. Victor had been in the same circles as the subjects of my last big story, the one that had cost me my career. A ring of smugglers who had infiltrated several legitimate businesses, using them as fronts for laundering money. When I'd exposed them, my career had gone down with it, thanks to some cleverly planted evidence that painted me as a willing participant. If Victor was connected to those people, then this wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about me, my past coming back to haunt me in ways I hadn't imagined. I called Alex immediately. "Do you think it's a coincidence?" I asked, pacing the length of my small living room, glancing at the window to make sure Clara wasn't anywhere nearby. "No such thing as coincidence in this business, David," Alex replied, his voice crackling over the line. "I'll keep digging, but you need to watch your back. If Victor's involved, he's not the type to play nice." I hung up, staring at the stack of photos I'd taken of Clara's meetings with Victor. They showed them in shadowy corners, exchanging briefcases and quiet words. There was something almost intimate about the way they interacted, like old friends sharing secrets. That thought twisted something ugly in my chest. I put the photos away and tried to focus on the facts, but my mind kept returning to that night at the docks, the way she'd looked over her shoulder, as if she sensed I was there. The following week, Alex called me with a new piece of the puzzle. "Found something interesting in Clara's financials," he said. "She's got a hidden account under a different name, Marissa Crow, and there have been some big deposits lately. I'm talking tens of thousands coming in every month." My grip tightened on the phone. "Who's sending the money?" "Hard to say. Looks like shell companies, all tied back to Victor's network. Whatever she's doing, she's being well compensated for it." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Clara had never mentioned any extra income, and our joint account hadn't seen any of that money. She told me she was struggling to make ends meet, that she didn't have a lot of savings. "She lied to me, Alex," I said, the bitterness seeping into my voice. "She told me she was barely scraping by, and all this time, she had a secret account?" "It gets worse," Alex said, and I could hear the tension in his voice. "I found a few emails she's been sending to Victor, using an encrypted service. I haven't cracked the encryption yet, but from the metadata, it looks like she's been coordinating with him for months." I sank into a chair, my thoughts racing. Months. Clara and I had been together for almost a year, which meant she'd been working with Victor since nearly the beginning. I thought of all the nights she'd held me close, whispered that I was the best thing that had ever happened to her. It was all a lie. Or maybe part of it was. That's what made it worse. I didn't know which parts were real and which were just part of her game. When Clara came home that night, I was waiting for her, the hidden account details spread across the kitchen table. She froze when she saw them, her expression shifting from confusion to something darker, more guarded. "What the hell is this, David?" she asked, her voice too calm. "Why are you going through my things? Why are you lying to me?" I shot back, standing up so abruptly that my chair scraped against the tile. "You told me you had no money, that you were barely getting by, and all this time you've been getting payments from Victor?" Her face paled, but she held her ground. "It's not what you think. Victor, he's been helping me. I got into trouble a few years back, and he helped me get out of it. The money is—" "Don't lie to me again," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I know you've been meeting him behind my back. I've seen you together at the docks. I've seen you with that case." Her composure cracked, her eyes filling with tears. But there was a hardness behind them that made me pause. "You don't understand, David. You've never understood. I did what I had to do." "Then tell me," I said, stepping closer, trying to see through her mask. "Tell me the truth, Clara. If you ever cared about me, give me that much." For a moment, she looked like she might. Her lips parted, and she seemed on the verge of some revelation. But then she shook her head, her expression turning cold. "I don't owe you anything, David. Not anymore." The words hit me like a blow, and I stepped back, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly, forcing the anger back down. "But I'm going to find out the truth. with or without your help. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I knew there was no going back. The game had already begun, and now I was more certain than ever that Clara and Victor had been playing me from the start. After our confrontation in the kitchen, Clara stopped trying to hide her late-night excursions. She no longer made excuses or softened her lies with touches of affection. Instead, she moved through the house like a ghost, her presence a constant reminder of the secrets she kept. The air between us had grown thick with mistrust, and every word we exchanged felt like a challenge. I tried to focus on my freelance work, but my mind kept drifting back to the documents Alex had sent me, to the images of Clara and Victor at the docks. Alex continued digging into Victor's background, but the deeper we went, the more tangled the connections became. One afternoon, Alex called me with news that sent a chill through my blood. "David, I found something. You're not going to like it." "What is it?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I dug up some old surveillance footage from your old case, the one that got you blacklisted. Victor was in the background of some of those meetings. It looks like he was working for the same network you were investigating back then." I sank into my chair, my mind spinning. If Victor was part of that ring, it meant that he might have been involved in setting me up all those years ago, in planting the false evidence that destroyed my career. And now he was back, creeping into my life through Clara, like a bad penny that kept turning up. "But there's more," Alex continued, his voice turning grim. "I think Clara might have known him longer than she's letting on. I found photos of her from a few years back. She was at a fundraiser in the city, and guess who was there with her? Victor." My heart pounded in my chest. Clara had told me she'd met Victor recently, that he was just a contact from a difficult time in her past. But if she'd known him for years, it meant she'd lied about the foundation of their relationship, about how deep their connection went. "She's been lying to me this whole time," I muttered, more to myself than to Alex. "David, you need to be careful. If she's been in this game with Victor for that long, there's no telling what she's capable of," Alex warned. "You might be the only one walking into this with your eyes half closed." I swallowed hard, staring out the window at the rolling waves. I knew he was right, but I wasn't ready to give up on finding the truth. Not yet. That night, I waited for Clara to return from one of her mysterious outings. She walked through the door just after midnight, carrying a large envelope tucked under her arm. When she saw me standing in the living room, her expression hardened. "What are you doing up?" she asked, her voice edged with irritation. "We need to talk, Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even as my anger simmered beneath the surface. She let out a bitter laugh, tossing the envelope onto the coffee table. "You want to talk now, after following me around like some jealous ex? What's left to say?" I ignored the jab, stepping closer. "I know you've known Victor for years. I know you've been working with him longer than you've told me. And I know about the money, the hidden account. What I don't know is why. Why lie to me? Why pretend this whole time?" For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes glinting with a mixture of anger and something else, something I couldn't quite read. Then she shook her head, her expression crumbling. "You wouldn't understand, David. It's not as simple as you think." "Then make me understand," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "Because right now, it looks like you've been playing me from the start." She sank into the armchair, burying her face in her hands. "Fine. You want the truth? Victor and I go way back, yes. He helped me out when I got into trouble with some debts. At first, I thought I could handle it, do a few jobs for him, pay off what I owed. But he kept pulling me deeper, always finding new ways to keep me under his thumb." Her voice wavered, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine or another performance. "When I met you, I thought I could finally get out. I thought maybe this time I could start over. But then he found out about us, about who you were, and he made me start digging into your past. He said if I didn't do it, he'd ruin me. He'd ruin us both." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe that she was just another pawn in Victor's game, that she'd gotten caught up in something bigger than herself. But the doubts clawed at my mind, tearing at the last threads of trust one had left. "You should have come to me sooner. You should have told me the truth." She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes, and for a moment, she seemed so vulnerable that it nearly broke me. "I was scared, David. Scared that you wouldn't believe me, that you'd think I was just using you. And maybe you're right. Maybe I deserve that. But I need your help now. Please, help me get out from under Victor's control. I turned away, pacing the length of the room, my mind a tangled mess of emotions. Was this another lie? Another way to manipulate me into helping her? Or was she finally telling me the truth, trusting me with her real story? I knew I couldn't make this decision alone, so I made a show of agreeing, telling her we'd figure out a plan together. But as soon as she went to bed, I called Alex, my voice barely above a whisper. She says she wants out, that Victor's been using her. I don't know if I can believe her. Alex was silent for a moment before responding. David, if she's lying, then she's playing a dangerous game. But if she's telling the truth, she's the only way you're going to get close enough to take down Victor. I know, I said, glancing down the hallway toward the closed bedroom door. That's what scares me. The next morning, Clara and I sat down to make a plan, our uneasy truce hanging in the air like a fraying thread. She claimed she could get Victor to meet with us again, but that it had to look like she was still playing her part, like she was setting me up. We can make it seem like I'm bringing you in, that you're willing to cooperate if it means clearing your name, she explained, her hands twisting together in her lap. But I need you to trust me, David. Just this once. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to answer her directly. Instead, I thought about the flash drive hidden in my desk, containing the recordings of her conversations with Victor, the photos of their meetings. I kept it close, knowing that it might be the only insurance I had left. As Clara outlined the details of the meeting, I watched her closely, searching for any sign that she was playing me again. But all I saw was the weariness in her eyes, the shadows under them that matched my own. It was almost enough to make me believe her. Almost. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting for some sign that I believed her story, that I was willing to take this risk with her. I forced a smile, pretending that I wasn't already preparing for the worst. All right, Clara, let's do it. She reached out to squeeze my hand, her touch warm against my cold skin. Thank you, David. I won't let you down. But as I met her gaze, all I could think about was the bitter taste of betrayal and the feeling that this game was far from over. Clara was good at pretending. I had to give her that. As we planned out our next move, she played the part of a willing partner perfectly, her voice steady, her expressions precise, as if she believed that we were in this together. But I'd learned to see the cracks beneath her surface, to notice the way her eyes darted toward her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, or the way her hands trembled when she spoke about Victor. Still, I played along, acting as if I believed in this alliance between us. I kept Alex in the loop, but even he was beginning to doubt whether this plan was a good idea. David, are you sure about this? He asked me during one of our late-night calls. You're walking into a trap, and you know it. If Clara is still working with Victor, then I'll have her and Victor both on record. I interrupted, gripping the phone tighter. This is our chance to catch him admitting to his smuggling operation, to get proof that he's been blackmailing her. And maybe me too. If she's lying, then I'll know. And if she's telling the truth, I'll let the sentence hang in the air, but Alex understood what I couldn't bring myself to say. If she's telling the truth, then maybe I'm not as alone in this as I think. You're playing a dangerous game, David, he muttered, his voice crackling over the line. But I'll be watching. Just don't trust her too much, okay? I promised I wouldn't. But deep down, I knew that I was already breaking that promise. There was still a part of me that wanted to believe Clara, that wanted to think she could be more than just another face in the long line of people who'd betrayed me. We arranged the meeting with Victor at a rundown factory near the docks, a place where the noise of the city faded into the lapping of waves and the hum of distant machinery. Clara told Victor that I was willing to come in from the cold, that I was desperate enough to cut a deal if it meant clearing my name. He agreed to meet, but his messages to Clara had been cryptic, vague instructions and warnings that made my skin crawl. If he even suspects that we're onto him, he'll walk away, Clara said as we drove toward the factory, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The wind swept through the open window, tangling her hair around her face, and she kept glancing at me like she was searching for something she couldn't find. He won't suspect a thing, I replied, adjusting the hidden recorder in my jacket pocket. I'd bought a new device, smaller and more reliable than the one I'd used before. It was the only insurance I had, a way to capture whatever Victor might say before things went south. Clara nodded, but she looked pale, her knuckles white against the wheel. David, if this goes wrong, if he realizes what we're doing, it won't, I said, cutting her off. Just do your part, and I'll do mine. She swallowed, her eyes fixed on the road. But she didn't say anything more, and I couldn't tell if she was relieved or disappointed. The factory loomed ahead, its windows dark and shattered, a relic of a time when this part of the city had been alive with industry. Clara parked the car behind a stack of rusted metal drums hidden from the street. As we stepped out, I scanned the area, noting the shadows that pooled between the crumbling walls, the distant sound of water against the docks. Clara led the way inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty space. We stopped in a wide, open room where broken beams crisscrossed the ceiling and graffiti covered the walls. Victor was already there, leaning against a support pillar, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. David, he drawled, his voice echoing in the cold air. I was starting to think you wouldn't show. I forced a tight smile, keeping my hands in my pockets where the recorder rested. Well, Clara made a convincing argument. Figured it was time to hear your side of things. Victor exhaled a plume of smoke, studying me with that same predatory smirk he always wore. You know, I always admired your stubbornness. You never knew when to quit, even when you should have. But you're in over your head, and we both know it. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice casual. You've made your point, Victor. Now, how about you tell me what you want from me? Victor's gaze shifted to Clara, and he nodded slightly. Did you tell him what happens if he plays nice? Clara swallowed, glancing between us. I told him you could make things go away, that you could help clear his name. And did you tell him what happens if he doesn't? Victor's smile widened, his teeth flashing in the dim light. Because I've got friends who would love to drag up the dirt you've buried, David. I'd hate to see your name splashed across the news again, with a fresh round of scandal attached. I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. You think I'm afraid of that? I've already been through it once, and I'm still here. Victor chuckled, pushing away from the pillar and taking a step closer. That's where you're wrong. This time, it'll be worse. And you won't just lose your reputation. You'll lose everything. He turned his attention to Clara, his expression hardening. And you, darling, you're not as clever as you think. You should have stayed in your lane. Clara flinched at the venom in his voice, but she lifted her chin. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Victor. Really? Victor's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. Because I've got a little insurance policy, just in case you try to cross me. A few recordings of my own, with your voice on them. How do you think David would feel if he heard what you really thought of him? Clara went pale, her breath catching, and she shot me a desperate look. But I refused to react, my mind racing as I processed what he'd said. If he had recordings of her, it meant he'd been using her as much as she'd been using me. It meant there were layers to this game that I hadn't seen. Let's cut the crap, Victor, I said, stepping forward, hoping to keep the upper hand. You're out of options. You think I don't know about the smuggling, the payoffs? I've got proof, and I'm willing to use it if you push me. Victor's eyes flashed, and he took a step back, his hand dipping into his coat pocket. You think you're in control here, but you're not. Before I could react, he pulled out a pistol, leveling it at me with a steady grip. Clara gasped, stumbling backward, her hands covering her mouth. My heart pounded, adrenaline flooding my veins, but I forced myself to hold his gaze, to keep my voice steady. You shoot me, and the evidence goes straight to the police. You'll be in a cell by the end of the night, I said, hoping he couldn't hear the tremor in my voice. Victor smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. Maybe, but I think you're bluffing. Clara moved suddenly, lunging toward him, trying to knock the gun out of his hand. A shot rang out, deafening in the empty space, and the next few moments blurred together. A struggle, the gun clattering across the floor, Clara's cry of pain. I dove for the gun, grabbing it before Victor could reach it. I aimed it at him, my hands shaking, and for a second, we were frozen in a standoff. Victor breathing heavily, Clara on the ground, clutching her arm where the bullet had grazed her. You don't have to do this, Clara gasped, her voice breaking. David, please. But I couldn't tell who she was speaking to. Victor's expression shifted, his smirk returning even as he held his wounded side. You think you've won, David? Go ahead. Pull the trigger. But she's been playing you just as much as I have. Ask her what she really wanted out of all this. I glanced at Clara, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Her silence cut deeper than anything Victor could have said. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight, and I knew that whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same. Victor's mocking smirk sent a chill down my spine. The gun in my hand felt heavier with each passing second, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Clara remained on the ground, clutching her bleeding arm, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. I kept my aim trained on Victor, but his words echoed in my mind, twisting like a knife. She's been playing you just as much as I have. Ask her what she really wanted out of all this. Clara shifted, pushing herself up on one elbow, her face pale with pain. David, don't listen to him. He's just trying to turn you against me. You know that, right? But doubt gnawed at my insides. I'd spent weeks trying to trust her, trying to believe that she wanted out of this as much as I did. But the look in her eyes now, part fear, part something else, made my resolve falter. Is that true, Clara? I demanded, my voice hoarse. Did you know what he was planning from the beginning? Were you setting me up this whole time? Her lips trembled, and she glanced between me and Victor, her expression wavering. I didn't have a choice, David. He threatened me. He said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin everything. I just wanted to survive. Victor let out a harsh laugh, wincing as he pressed a hand to his wounded side. That's a pretty story, Clara. But you forgot to mention the part where you came to me first, begging for a way to make a quick buck. And the part where you were all too eager to use your boyfriend's past against him. My grip on the gun tightened, and I turned the barrel toward Clara, my heart thundering in my chest. Is that true? I demanded, each word sharper than the last. You told me you wanted to leave, that he was forcing you. Was that all a lie? She shook her head, her expression breaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. It wasn't all a lie, David. I did go to him, but I never meant for it to go this far. I thought it would be easy, just one job, and then I could walk away. But then I met you, and things changed. I never wanted you to get hurt. Too late for that, sweetheart, Victor sneered, struggling to his feet. But hey, at least you had fun while it lasted, right? I glanced between them, my mind racing, trying to find a thread of truth in the mess of lies. Clara's face crumpled, her eyes wide with desperation as she reached out toward me. Please, David, I'm telling you the truth now. Just help me, and we can still get out of this. My finger hovered over the trigger, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Victor's smirk, Clara's pleading eyes, the cold weight of the gun. Everything blurred together. I didn't know who to believe anymore. Didn't know if I could trust the woman I'd once thought I loved. Victor took another step forward, his voice low and taunting. You're a fool, David. She played you from the start, just like I did. You should have stayed out of this. Before I could react, he lunged at Clara, trying to drag her up by her wounded arm. She screamed, struggling against him, but he was stronger, pulling her up against his chest like a shield. He reached into his coat with his free hand, drawing out a small, hidden blade that glinted in the dim light. Back off, or I'll make sure she doesn't live to see another sunrise, he hissed, his voice filled with cold fury. My heart pounded in my ears, and I kept the gun aimed at him, trying to steady my breathing. Let her go, Victor. This ends now. He grinned, the blade pressed dangerously close to Clara's neck. Oh, it's ending all right, but not the way you think. In that split second, Clara twisted in his grip, driving her elbow into Victor's side with all the strength she had left. He grunted in pain, the blade slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. I didn't hesitate. I rushed forward, grabbing Victor's arm, struggling to pull him away from Clara. We grappled, our feet sliding across the dusty concrete, the gun slipping from my grasp and skidding across the floor. Victor's fingers closed around my throat, squeezing, and for a moment I saw stars dance in my vision. But I managed to twist free, grabbing the blade he dropped and swinging it wildly. The blade caught Victor's side, and he let out a strangled gasp, stumbling back, blood soaking through his shirt. He He fell to the floor, clutching his wound, his breaths coming in harsh, desperate gasps. Clara scrambled back, her hand pressed to her bleeding arm, her eyes wide as she stared at Victor's prone form. I stumbled to my feet, the blade slipping from my grasp, my hands shaking. "It's over, Clara," I panted, my voice raw. "Call the police. Now!" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the gun lying a few feet away. For a terrifying moment, I thought she might reach for it, that she might turn it on me instead of Victor. But then she nodded, scrambling to her feet and pulling out her phone. I watched her dial with trembling hands, my body tense, ready for another turn of the knife. But she called the police, her voice shaking as she reported the situation, the address, the injuries. I kept my eyes on her the whole time, waiting for the next betrayal, the next lie. But she didn't turn against me. Not yet. As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Victor let out a wheezing laugh, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think this changes anything, David? You're still a pawn. And she'll leave you the moment you're not useful anymore." I glanced at Clara, but she was focused on the phone call, her face pale and drawn. I knelt beside Victor, grabbing a fistful of his shirt, forcing him to look at me. "Why did you target me? What did you want?" He grinned, his teeth stained red with blood. "It was never just about you. It was about insurance. Clara knew the risks, and she knew you'd do anything for her. Even now, look at you." I felt my grip tighten, my vision blurring with anger. "You won't get away with this, Victor." His breath rattled in his chest, and he let out one last choked laugh. "We'll see." He coughed, a wet, gurgling sound, and his eyes glazed over as he slumped back against the floor. The sirens were right outside now, flashing lights spilling through the broken windows. I let go of Victor, stumbling back, my heart racing as the full weight of what had happened crashed down on me. Clara hung up the phone, turning to face me. For a moment, we stood there, staring at each other across the blood-stained floor, the air thick with everything we hadn't said. She took a shaky step toward me, her hand outstretched, her expression full of pain. "David, I never wanted it to end like this. I'm sorry." I wanted to believe her, but as the police burst through the doors, as they shouted for us to get on the ground, I couldn't stop hearing Victor's final words, couldn't stop seeing the way Clara had hesitated before making that call. I dropped to my knees, raising my hands, and she followed suit, her eyes locked on mine as the officers moved between us. Even as they cuffed us, even as they separated us, she kept watching me, like she thought I might understand something she couldn't say. But all I felt was the cold, empty space where my trust had once been. The police station was cold, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the interrogation room. I sat with my hands cuffed to the table, the weight of the night pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Outside the door, I could hear the murmured voices of the detectives, the faint shuffle of paperwork as they pieced together the story that had brought me here. Victor was dead, and now, the truth would either set me free or bury me under a mountain of suspicion. They questioned Clara first, taking her into another room while paramedics patched up the wound on her arm. I tried to listen through the walls, to catch snippets of her voice, but all I heard was the murmur of hushed, urgent tones. When they finally came for me, they didn't give me much, just a terse command to sit down and wait. The door creaked open, and Detective Martinez stepped inside, his face etched with exhaustion. He dropped a file on the table, flipping it open to reveal photos of Victor's body, the blood-stained factory floor, and Clara's tear-streaked face. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, his expression unreadable. "You've had an interesting night, Mr. Harper," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Care to explain how it all went down?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Victor was blackmailing Clara. She said she wanted out, so we set up the meeting to get him to talk. Things went south when he pulled a gun. Yeah, I've heard her version of events. Martinez cut in, his eyes narrowing. But here's the thing. We found recordings. A whole stash of them in Victor's apartment. Some of them feature your girlfriend, saying some pretty damning things about you. My heart lurched, the room seeming to tilt around me. What kind of things? He flipped open the file, pulling out a transcript. David's easy to manipulate. He still thinks he can play the hero, like he's saving me from something. And here's another one. We'll get what we need out of him, and then we're done. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs, my vision narrowing to the file on the table. Clara had spoken those words, had plotted with Victor to use me. But how much of it had been true? How much had been twisted by fear or desperation? Martinez watched me carefully, his expression hard. You're not the first guy to get played by a pretty face, Harper. But the question is, were you in on it from the start? Or did you really think she was telling the truth? I shook my head, my voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I thought she wanted out. He closed the file with a snap, leaning forward. Maybe you're telling the truth. Maybe you're not. Either way, Victor's dead, and that makes things complicated. But here's the twist, Harper. Clara's backing you up. She says you saved her life, that you had no idea what Victor was planning. I blinked, struggling to process his words. She said that? Martinez's expression softened, just a little. Yeah, she's still facing charges for her involvement with Victor's operations, but she's making it sound like you were just caught in the middle. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Even now, even after everything, Clara was still spinning the story, shaping it to fit whatever outcome she thought would save her. I couldn't tell if it was an act of kindness or just another manipulation, another way to keep me from turning against her. They released me the next day, but the warning in Martinez's eyes was clear. Don't leave town, Harper. And if you hear from her again, you call us. I nodded, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down on me as I walked out of the station into the cold dawn light. Clara had been taken into custody, awaiting trial for her part in Victor's schemes. The media had already latched onto the story, turning it into a spectacle. Local journalists caught in web of smuggling and murder, and I knew it was only a matter of time before my face was splashed across the headlines again. I drove back to the cottage, the place where this nightmare had begun. The silence was oppressive, the rooms filled with the ghosts of conversations and confessions. I couldn't stand to be there, couldn't bear the reminders of the life I'd tried to build with Clara. So I packed a bag and left, driving aimlessly down the coastal highway, my mind replaying the events of that night on a loop. The things Clara had said, the way she'd looked at me before the police arrived, it all blurred together, a tangle of lies and half-truths that I couldn't unravel. I pulled over at a cliffside rest stop, overlooking the ocean, and sat on the hood of my car, staring out at the waves. The wind whipped at my face, cold and sharp, but it did nothing to clear the ache in my chest. A few days later, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a voice memo, and my heart pounded as I played it, recognizing Clara's voice immediately. David, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for what I did, but I want you to know, I never meant for it to end this way. I wanted out, but I couldn't see a way to escape without losing everything. I thought, maybe if I kept lying, if I kept pretending, I could find a way to fix it. But I was wrong. She paused, and I heard the crackle of static, the sound of her breath catching. I'm sorry, David, for all of it. I'm sorry you got hurt, and I hope you find some way to move on. Maybe you'll be able to forgive me someday. Maybe not, but I needed to say it. The message cut off, leaving only the sound of the wind through my car windows. I played it again and again, trying to hear some hint of sincerity, some proof that she had meant those words. But all I heard was the voice of a woman I couldn't trust, offering an apology I couldn't accept. I stayed by the coast, writing out the story that no one would believe, an expose of Victor's operations, of the corruption that had tainted my life twice over. But even as I sent it off to old contacts, knowing it would become another headline, I knew it wouldn't give me the closure I needed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara's face, heard her voice on that recording, whispering promises that had turned to ash. I thought about visiting her in prison, demanding answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I knew I'd never get the truth from her. Not the real truth, the one that mattered. As the days turned to weeks, I kept expecting another message, another twist in the story she'd written around us. But nothing came, and slowly, I realized that she had finally let me go, even if I couldn't do the same. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through the message Clara had left me. My finger hovered over the delete button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Instead, I turned my gaze to the ocean, to the endless waves that crashed against the shore, and I thought about the life I'd lost, the woman I'd loved, and the secrets that had pulled us both under. I knew that some part of me would always be waiting for another twist, another revelation that might change everything. But the only sound was the whisper of the wind, and the only truth I had left was that trust, once shattered, never truly heals. As I drove away from the coast, leaving the memories of Clara and Victor behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched by the ghosts of the past, by the shadows that had always followed me. And I knew that the story wasn't over. Not yet.